trachea. And that's actually what happened to our science secretary last winter. No, this winter. Yeah, she choked and she ended up dying from it. Anyway, so I think I looked it up and I was surprised to see how many people actually die from choking on substances each year. Okay, so the sensory system is actually part of the nervous system because sensory receptors are modified neurons. So when we think about sensation, we generally think about what we perceive externally, so like touch and smell and taste and pain, but we also have internal receptors. So they're external and internal. So it's important to realize that we have receptors that detect blood pH, right? We have receptors that detect glucose concentrations. And when they go awry, that is diabetes. And then we also have receptors that detect blood pressure. So we actually have receptors in our major arteries that detect when our blood pressure is too high or too low. And so we are able to respond to that with a mechanism that would boost blood pressure or decrease blood pressure to try to maintain homeostasis. So the stimuli is the energy that has to be turned into an action potential. So the stimuli could be chemical. And if it is chemical, then the chemical information is taken in by chemoreceptors. So for example, smell and taste are two sensations that are caused by chemicals binding to chemical or chemoreceptors. I'll put chemicals there. And then this gets transduced. So we have a process called transduction, which turns it into an action potential. So say the binding of glucose, if you're on your tongue, would cause action potential to be sent to that part of your cerebral cortex that would detect sweet. We also have stimuli that are mechanical. So these are called mechanoreceptors. And two sensations that are accomplished by mechanoreceptors are touch and hearing. And then those are transduced into an action potential. That whole transduction has to take place. So we're going to talk about hearing in more detail when we talk about the structure of the ear. We also have specialized receptors called nociceptors. Oops, sorry. So the stimuli, sorry, would be damaged tissue. And so these are pain receptors. So this is pain. And that is transduced into an action potential that tells us that we have damage to our tissues. Now you can feel it internally as well as externally. So if you cut yourself, bite your tongue, right? Or if your pancreas bursts, you're going to feel pain, right? And those nociceptors are able to sense chemicals. They're actually a special type of chemoreceptors that are the stimuli, however, is because when we damage our tissue, particular chemicals are released by white blood cells that make us sense pain.
So can those can get like messed up?
Yes, and so, for example, the most common example of damage to the nervous system and pain is with diabetes. So you can have neuropathy where people will not feel anything in their feet, right? And so then they'll tend to get sores on their feet, and those sores will tend to get infected, and then that infection will lead possibly to amputation, right? So pain receptors can become non-functioning if you can't sense the body part. So high glucose actually is very, very bad to neurons. It causes neuronal death. However, there is something that is referred to as chronic pain syndrome. And maybe this is what you're referring to. So chronic pain syndrome is when you're receiving painful signals, but there is no damage. So no damage, but you sense pain. And so this is why in big cities they have chronic pain clinics where you might go to. It's also because a lot of people are living with chronic pain, like from back injuries or whatever. And the chronic pain syndrome, however, is really interesting because pain is not the symptom. There's actually no cause for the pain. So pain is actually the disease. Okay. And they think it actually has to do with the sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight sympathetic nervous system. And it generally follows a injury. So my sister actually has the chronic pain syndrome, and it is awful. So like, for example, she fell down and hurt her arm, and everything healed up, but her arm was still in a lot of pain. And then the pain actually spread to her leg. And so she can't even walk, right? So she uses a cane or a walker, and she's just in chronic pain all the time. And the doctors are like, we cannot find anything wrong with you, right? And when they can't find anything wrong with you, they think it is in your mind, but it could actually be a malfunction of the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic nervous system. So it's a malfunction in the sympathetic nervous system. And there are drugs that you can take to reduce this pain, but hopefully it will just essentially get better. So this is actually really debilitating. And I actually have a little video that I want to show you that specifically talks about this pain. It's an 8-minute TED Talk, and it's a doctor talking about this type of pain in one of his patients.
So I know you're mentioning this, but then what's it called when like you don't necessarily hurt yourself really bad, but you get bruised really easily? What would that be?
That could be due to bad clotting proteins. So let's say you bruise really easily. So that means that maybe you don't have, you bleed easily, you hemorrhage easily, because that's what it is bruising is hemorrhaging. And so it could be that you have a defect in one of your clotting proteins that makes it more likely that you'll bleed. And so then sometimes you have to go on, drugs to do that. But I know some people are just more easily bruised than others. I'm really easily bruised. And my daughter has easy bruising, but that actually goes along with, we think she has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is hyper joint mobility and really elastic skin, which damages the blood vessels. So there's other things that can cause bruising. Yeah. But this is actually where pain becomes the illness instead of just a symptom.
My sister had something called like reflex neurovascular.
This is kind of it. This is what, yeah. So this is kind of what he's talking about here.
I'm a pediatrician and an anesthesiologist, so I put children to sleep for a living. And I'm an academic, so I put audiences to sleep for free. But what I actually mostly do is I manage the pain management service at the Packard Children's Hospital up in Stanford and Palo Alto. And it's from the experience of about 20 or 25 years of doing that I want to bring to you the message this morning that pain is a disease. Now, most of the time you think of pain as a symptom of a disease, and that's true most of the time. It's the symptom of a tumor or an infection or an inflammation or an operation. But about 10% of the time, after the patient has recovered from one of those events, pain persists. It persists for months and oftentimes for years. And when that happens, it is its own disease. And before I tell you about how it is that we think that happens and what we can do about it, I want to show you how it feels for my patients. So imagine, if you will, that I'm stroking your arm with this feather, as I'm stroking my arm right now. Now I want you to imagine that I'm stroking it with this. Please keep your seat. A very different feeling. Now, what does it have to do with chronic pain? Imagine, if you will, these two ideas together. Imagine what your life would be like if I were to stroke it with this feather, but your brain was telling you that this is what you were feeling. And that is the experience of my patients with chronic pain. In fact, imagine something even worse. Imagine I were to stroke your child's arm with this feather, and their brain were telling them that they were feeling this hot torch. That was the experience of my patient Chandler, whom you see in the photograph. As you can see, she's a beautiful young woman. She was 16 years old last year when I met her, and she aspired to be a professional dancer. And during the course of one of her dance rehearsals, she fell on her outstretched arm and sprained her wrist. Now, you would probably imagine, as she did, that a wrist sprain is a trivial event in a person's life. Wrap it in an ace bandage, take some ibuprofen for a week or two, and that's the end of the story. But in Chandler's case, that was the beginning of the story. This is what her arm looked like when she came to my clinic about 3 months after her sprain. You can see that the arm is discolored, purplish in color. It was cadaverically cold to the touch. The muscles were frozen, paralyzed. Dystonic is how we refer to that. The pain had spread from her wrist to her hands, to her fingertips, from her wrist up to her elbow, almost all the way to her shoulder. But the worst part was not the spontaneous pain that was there 24 hours a day. The worst part was that she had allodynia, the medical term for the phenomenon that I just illustrated with the feather and with the torch. The lightest touch of her arm, the touch of a hand, the touch even of a sleeve of a garment as she put it on, caused excruciating, burning pain. How can the nervous system get this so wrong? How can the nervous system misinterpret an innocent sensation like the touch of a hand and turn it into the malevolent sensation of the touch of the flame? Well, you probably imagine that the nervous system in the body is hardwired like your house. In your house, wires run in the wall from the light switch to a junction box in the ceiling, and from the junction box to the light bulb. And when you turn the switch on, the light goes on, and when you turn the switch off, the light goes off. So people imagine the nervous system is just like that. If you hit your thumb with a hammer, these wires in your arm that, of course, we call nerves, transmit the information up to the junction box in the spinal cord, where new wires, new nerves, take the information up to the brain, where you become consciously aware that your thumb is now hurt. But the situation, of course, in the human body is far more complicated than that. Instead of it being the case that that junction box in the spinal cord is just simply where one nerve communicates with the next nerve, by releasing these little brown packets of chemical information called neurotransmitters in a linear one-on-one fashion. In fact, what happens is the neurotransmitters spill out in 3 dimensions, laterally, vertically, up and down in the spinal cord, and they start interacting with other adjacent cells. These cells, called glial cells, were once thought to be unimportant structural elements of the spinal cord that did nothing more than hold all the important things together like the nerves. But it turns out the glial cells have a vital role in the modulation, amplification, and in the case of pain, the distortion of sensory experiences. These glial cells become activated, their DNA starts to synthesize new proteins which spill out and interact with adjacent nerves, and they start releasing their neurotransmitters. And those neurotransmitters spill out and activate adjacent glial cells, and so on and so forth, until what we have is a positive feedback loop. It's almost as if somebody came into your home and rewired your wall so that the next time you turned on the light switch, the toilet flushed 3 doors down, or your dishwasher went on, or your computer monitor turned off. That's crazy, but that's in fact what happens with chronic pain, and that's why pain becomes its own disease. The nervous system has plasticity. It changes and it morphs in response to stimuli. Well, what do we do about that? What can we do in a case like Chandler's? We treat these patients in a rather crude fashion at this point in time. We treat them with symptom-modifying drugs, painkillers, which are frankly not very effective for this kind of pain. We take nerves that are noisy and active, that should be quiet, and we put them to sleep with local anesthetics. And most importantly, what we do is we use a rigorous and often uncomfortable process of physical therapy and occupational therapy to retrain the nerves in the nervous system to respond normally to the activities and sensory experiences that are part of everyday life. And we support all of that with an intensive psychotherapy program to address the despondency, despair, and depression that always accompanies severe chronic pain. It's successful, as you can see from this video of Chandler, who 2 months after we first met her is now doing a backflip. And I had lunch with her yesterday because she's a college student studying dance in Long Beach here, and she's doing absolutely fantastic. But the future is actually even brighter. The future holds the promise that new drugs will be developed that are not symptom-modifying drugs that simply mask the problem as we have now, but that will be disease-modifying drugs that will actually go right to the root of the problem and attack those glial cells or those pernicious proteins that the glial cells elaborate that spill over and cause the central nervous system windup or plasticity that so is capable of distorting and amplifying the sensory experience that we call pain. So that I have hope that in the future, the prophetic words of George Carlin will be realized, who said, "My philosophy, no pain, no pain." Thank you very much.
Okay. So Emily, was that what your sister experienced?
Yeah.
There's other, fibromyalgia is another disease that causes pain, but that is believed to due to the vascularization of your connective tissue. And we have connective tissue throughout the body. So sometimes people with fibromyalgia also have chronic pain syndrome. So pain normally is a really good thing because it tells us when there is something wrong, like when we've damaged an organ or damaged our body, right? But that is where pain goes wrong, right? Okay, so we also have electromagnetic energy. Okay. So this would be, for example, muscle contractions. And for example, sharks have the ability to sense the electricity that is produced by these muscle contractions, as do the duck-billed platypus. And we talked about the duck-billed platypus because it is an example of a monotreme, or a mammal that actually lays eggs and sweats milk. But that duck bill, actually they use it to find their prey, which would be like crayfish and other small invertebrates and vertebrates, like frogs, for example. And they can actually sense the muscle contractions of their prey. Okay. We can also look at the magnetic fields of the Earth. And so there is a lot of evidence that birds can migrate and find their way around. We'll put bird migration based upon the magnetic field that they can see. So we can't see the magnetic field, but they can. So they know where north, south, east, and west is based upon the fields that they visualize. Oops, I spelled migration wrong. Migration. Okay. We also have light energy. So we can see light energy, and this is vision, and it is due to photoreceptors. So we're going to talk about the photoreceptors in the eye that are able to absorb light energy and transduce it into an action potential. And then we can also talk about heat energy. So we're going to talk about thermoreceptors, but some organisms are able to see heat. So can you give me an example of an organism that hunts its prey based upon being able to see the heat that is radiated from them? Yeah.
Is it snakes?
Some snakes, yes. So specifically the pit vipers, which include the rattlesnakes, right? So they have a special, they generally have this shape of their head is a triangle rather than just kind of rounded, and they have specific receptors that can detect heat energy. And so the rattlesnake would be able to see the heat of its prey and be able to find it in that way. So we do have receptors on the surface of our skin. So there's actually receptors associated with your hair follicles. So if something is walking across the surface of your skin, it might move the hairs. We also have touch receptors inside of our skin like this one. This is a touch receptor that would be able to detect pressure. And then we also have free nerve endings on the surface of the skin that are actually nociceptors. So these would be the free nerve endings, and also thermoreceptors. So we're actually going to be looking at the perception of temperature today in lab. So we do have lots of receptors associated with the skin, specifically touch and pain and temperature. But when we look at smell, these would be the chemoreceptors that are located in your nasal cavity. And so one really interesting thing about smell is that it has these neurons that dangle down into the nasal cavity. Now this isn't anywhere where you would actually be able to reach with like your finger. So like the vestibule is where our finger reaches. And so this up here is tissue that is really easily damaged. It's called a mucosa. And when it bleeds, that's when you get the bloody nose. But these receptors dangle down, and so when we breathe in chemicals, the chemicals bind to the receptors and then send an action potential to the olfactory bulb. So smell is due to odors, which are airborne chemicals. Okay. These go into the nasal cavity and bind to olfactory receptors. Now, when they did the human genome, they discovered that there were about 400 smell genes, which means that there's about 400 different types of receptors in humans. So about 400 receptors. It's believed that dogs, for example, and cats and other organisms, other mammals, have a lot more receptors, different types of receptors. And so then it goes into what is called the olfactory bulb. And this is actually, the olfactory bulb is unconscious, but connected to our memory system. So it's connected to memories. So a lot of our sensation of smell is very difficult for us to verbally communicate or to describe, but we tend to describe it based upon memories. Like I have a memory of what my middle school bathroom smelled like, based upon the soap that they used, right? The white or the the granular peak soap, powder soap, right? And so they believe that a lot of what we are responding to in terms of odors, we do not consciously perceive. So you might feel good in a particular environment, and it might be because of the chemicals that are in the air. So, you know, using perfumes or pheromones in an environment might get people to linger there longer, even though they consciously don't perceive the smell. Okay. Then remember that it has to go to the olfactory cortex for conscious perception to be activated.